continue reading Venerable Father. I'm going to skip forward a little bit to chapter 2. Page 37. Suzuki Roshi said something like, "Our only effort should be to continue our practice." At that period, I was immersed in the day-to-day struggle to survive. New people usually go to the forest with a lot of inspiration and faith and are able to impose rigid self-discipline for a while, but when they start to lose all of that, it's a sign that they've arrived. All the mental hindrances and obstructions beneath the surface start to emerge. I guess I got progressively sloppier in some ways, but I was still only a novice, and full ordination, upasampada, as a bhikkhu was coming soon, for me and 2 other Westerners. Ajahn Chah had made us wait for many months. By the time I received upasampada, I had been a novice for 20 months. But he told us one day that as novices we practiced 50%. As monks we would have to give 100%. Of course, it wasn't merely a matter of going through a ceremony and then having to try harder. The bhikkhu has a very detailed code of discipline for regulating all his behavior, which a novice can only emulate in part, and without the same compulsion, not having taken the vows. Ajahn Chah also emphasized over and over that we should be prepared to complete 5 years as a minimum. This was the tradition found in the Vinaya, the scriptural rule for monks, but it is rarely adhered to in the present. Basically, what he was telling us was that after 5 years as a monk is able to take care of himself, he is literally said to be beyond dependence. The Buddha, Ajahn Chah said, practiced for 5 years and endured a lot of suffering. In his 6th year, he found peace. But time didn't mean much to me then. I really had no future I could conceive of. He might as well have said 7 years or 5 lifetimes. It all seemed like such an impossibly long stretch, an inconceivably difficult task. There are many rare experiences that one is privileged to by living in a monastery, and living without a future is one of them. That was perhaps the most terrifying thing about ordaining. I have often thought since then that people can sacrifice anything as long as they still have the future to look forward to. To me, there was simply nothing else I could imagine myself doing, nowhere else to be, no other life to live. Looking back on those days now, it seems like a different lifetime or a memory of a movie I once saw. Ajahn Chah once said to me, years later, "When you look back, you have to laugh. When you think what it used to be like for Warapanyo, you have to laugh." The hopelessness and desperation which I constantly lived with seem very precious in retrospect, because I was really living in the present moment. My suffering and difficulty were a concrete, tangible experience that I could always get my teeth into. I only attempted to survive. I didn't fantasize about getting enlightened or attaining anything. Later on, friends and relatives would hear about my monastic path and say what a courageous thing that was to do, how it must have taken stamina, faith, high ideals, etc. But that wasn't the case. I was simply desperate. Ajahn Chah's way of pushing people past their limits of endurance was so suitable to one like me. Patience is the easiest of the perfections to practice, I often philosophized, because you don't have to do anything. You just sit there and bear it. Ordination time approached. The week before, there was an ordination for novices at Wat Papong. During the ceremony, I looked over at Ajahn Chah. I thought about the 5-year commitment. I felt like a groom looking at his bride-to-be and asking himself if she was the right one for him, if he really wanted to go through with it. Yes, I thought, I do. We were ordained with 19 ties. Although we were senior to all of them, i.e., had been ordained as novices longer, he ordained us last. This meant that we would always have to sit and walk in line after them. Seniority is a big thing there, and this was one of his favorite techniques to put you in a position where your pride would get stirred up and wounded. More than merely teaching people, Ajahn Chah trained them, creating a general environment and specific situations where they could learn about themselves and let go of what they had learned. Over the years, he would say things like, "Of what I teach, you understand maybe 15%. Or, "He's been a monk for 5 years, so he understands 5%. A junior monk said in response to the latter, "So I must have 1% since I've been here for 1 year." But he said, "No, the first 4 years, no percent. Then the 5th year, you have 5%. So I think his emphasis was on training, not teaching to understand. Which is not to say he didn't teach profound Dhamma. But often I wouldn't understand something he had taught or said informally, only to have the meaning become clearer upon hearing it again or recalling it at some later time, often much later, months or years. And this kind of understanding came, I believe, from the training that had taken place in the interval. As Wat Pah Pong got more well-known, monks started coming from all over Thailand to visit or stay. Some of them were quite senior, a few even senior to Ajahn Chah. Such monks are normally accustomed to being treated with deference and respect, but he treated all newcomers pretty much the same. A visitor was told he could stay 3 nights, during which time he would usually have to sleep in the sala, the main meeting hall. If he was serious about staying to practice and had a letter from his preceptor or the monastery he came from, he would be given a kuti and put through a probationary period. He would sit at the end of the line and not be allowed to take part in official Sangha functions, such as the fortnightly Uposatha ceremony, the confession of offenses and recitation of the 227 Patimokkha rules. After a few months, they would be admitted to regular status, but first had to forfeit all robes and equipment, which they had bought themselves. Sometimes they had bought beautiful things which they were quite attached to. He especially liked to give the old men a hard time, the ones who had ordained later in life. I recall one nice old gentleman from a village monastery who had been ordained 15 or 20 years. He had a new alms bowl, and Ajahn Chah took it away from him as soon as he came, gave him an old, small, cheaply made bowl, and put him at the end of the line. Ajahn Chah was not one to humor people's pride, attachments, or eccentricities. Those who could stand up to his testing usually found their stay at Wat Pah Pong worthwhile. I had been told that being a bhikkhu with the Vinaya rules to keep would make a big difference, and just having the 3rd robe to wear over my shoulder actually did make things feel different. Ajahn Chah told us that as he was our teacher, we were to take dependence with him, and that this meant literally to depend on him for our spiritual and physical needs. We were like children now, he told us, our minds controlled by desire and ignorance. We were unable to take care of ourselves, so we had to have guidance from someone. We were obligated to serve and obey our teacher, and he in turn was responsible for our welfare. This is obviously a radically different approach to living, yet once you're in it, it makes the utmost sense. The same with the Vinaya rules. They cover virtually everything you do in the course of the day, and he taught new monks to take them extremely seriously, to the point of not being able to sleep if you thought you might be violating a rule. Many of the rules mean nothing at all outside of the monastery, yet they are a very efficacious tool for training the mind. Over the years, I was to hear him emphasize that the foundation for practice is moral conduct and correct view. The day-to-day living was mostly unspectacular and often very dull. You might usually feel that you weren't getting anywhere, and then one day, months and years later, you realized that some very big changes had taken place. He was separating us, the 3 Westerners, Farang. Farang is the word for Westerner in Thai. He was separating us, the 3 Farang, sending us to branch temples for the Rains retreat. Before we went, we decided to talk to him about what we felt was wrong in the Wat, mostly concerning the ways others were living and practicing. Of course, this was in very poor taste, especially by Thai standards, but we were pretty sincere about it. We enumerated the complaints, to which he answered, "I don't teach them to do those things," in a very straightforward way. Then he said that it was just the way things are and always have been. When the policeman is around, the thieves behave themselves. If he asks, "Are there any thieves here?" they will say, "No, not here." But as soon as he's gone, they're at it again. It was like that in Ajahn Mun's Wat. It was like that in the Buddha's time. So just watch yourself. Don't be concerned with what others do. Then he added, addressing me, "Warapanyo is like a football. Do you know what a football is? Someone kicks it, boom, and it flies across the field. Then someone else kicks it and it flies off in another direction. Then it's kicked again." We continued talking, and I brought up some other doubts that I had. But now he had taken the offensive. Warapanyo is like a dog with a sore on its head. You know what a sore is? The dog lies down to rest, and the flies start eating his sore, so he gets up and runs off to another spot. He settles down, but more flies find him and start eating his sore again. He runs away again, but the flies will always catch up with him because of the sore. I was sent to a small, newly established temple in a grubby forest with tiny little trees. There were about 10 monks and novices. Away from friends in the familiar setting of Wat Pa Pong, I was once again alone with my thoughts. Naturally, doubts began to arise. I was corresponding with a friend at home, and he wrote to reassure me. "Clad in the yellow robes of a Buddhist monk, you live a life of quiet contemplation, cultivating awareness with each breath." Sounds good. One afternoon during work period, as I hauled logs around in the hot sun, I recalled these words and savored the humor. Rare indeed is the monk who puts an end to doubt. Perhaps nowhere does the deluded mind display all its subtlety as in the dazzling array of doubts, uncertainties, and objections it puts forth. New monks especially are a prey to it, as almost anything can trigger doubt. Doubt about Buddhism, about monk's life, about the teacher, the monastery, the food one eats, about one's ability or kamma, about methods of meditation. Ajahn Chah and Sumedho both had a very direct approach for getting through the maze, which was simply to understand doubt as doubt and nothing more, see it arise and pass away in the mind like anything else, and not be seduced into following it and building on it. When you see clearly that doubt or anything else has arisen in the mind, you have knowledge, so what is there to doubt about? Sumedho sometimes suggested the koan method of doubting the doubt, but more often he emphasized determination to stick to it, let go of your mind, burn your bridges, step off the cliff. During the hot season, before my bhikkhu ordination, he came to Wat Pa Pong for a brief visit, and I dumped my doubts and frustrations on him. One visiting Farung monk in particular had told me that the body is the vehicle for practice. If your living situation weakened your body, then maybe it wasn't right for you, etc. Sumedho said, "Warapanyo, I have listened to all these Farung monks and they're all full of shit." But the doubts would always return. With great compassion, Ajahn Chah didn't let people muddle along on the same track forever, but would put them in situations where things could come to a head. So it turned out that he had set me up. As Vasa began, things got quite strict. I felt the noose tightening and I was not happy. I was constantly being checked and reprimanded by both the abbot, a crusty old man, and the second monk, a young firebrand who actually did the teaching. There was often plenty of manual labor to do, and the morning and evening practice of meditation and chanting was supplemented by hours of reading and explanation of the Vinaya, which is generally agreed upon as one of the most deadly, boring experiences in the great Kiliocosm. It even cured my hiccups once. Finally, I decided that I shouldn't be living in that Wat, and one afternoon I went to the abbot. "I'm leaving," I said. "I'm going back to Wat Pa Pong." "You can't leave," he said. "The Vasa has already begun. You must wait until it ends." "I don't care. I'm leaving." "You can't," he insisted. "Your Ajahn sent you here, so you stay here." "Then I will disrobe," I said, "but I can't live here." We went back and forth like this until finally he said, "It's time to bathe," and got up and walked away, leaving me sitting there thinking about going over the wall. But I stayed. I talked with the second monk, Ajahn Ñāṇiko. He acknowledged that the living wasn't easy. However, he said, It's pure. This kind of life is faultless. There's no wrongdoing which is involved, no harm brought upon oneself or others. I sat through the endless readings and discourses with pain in my legs and misery and defiance in my heart. One evening, after we had adjourned, but we were still sitting around in the sala, he asked me how I felt about all of this, and I said I had my doubts about the value of it. He asked if doubting brought me happiness. What did I have that was worth holding on to? I was just heading toward old age and death like everyone else. What good would it do to remain in ignorance? I said that I had thought meditation was the way to find freedom, but I had little time to meditate, what with all the work, chanting, and readings. He replied that while I sat in my kuti trying to meditate, my defilements were standing outside, watching me and laughing at me. Learning to live by the Vinaya, the graceful behavior that brought awareness into everything we do, was what could really help me. It was his responsibility to teach the new monks, not to just let them flounder around, he reminded me, and he urged me to hang in there and give it a try. By the end of the Vasa, he promised, Warapanyo will be a new person. Then he let me know that Lungpor had sent me there for just this purpose. He had told him to watch me closely and not let me do as I please. Warapanyo likes his pleasure and comfort, Ajahn Chah had told him. Don't let him have his way. So that was how the old man worked. One time, the following year, when there were a bunch of new Farang at Wat Pah Pong, he said to me, at first, just let people be. Give them freedom to do as they please. Then they show themselves, and you get to know all about them. After that, you can start training them accordingly. This is the way to teach disciples. Hearing that made clear so much of what had passed. Once I determined to try harder, the routine started making more sense. The Vinaya began to seem like a golden path leading out of confusion and suffering. I was relearning everything. The rules covered every little action in the course of the day: eating, bathing, walking, talking, dressing. Even clearing my throat in the sala would bring a reprimand. Warapanyo, that's not beautiful. Well, from the outside this sounds very oppressive, but in fact it actually makes life simpler and freer. You stop thinking about what you want and how you would prefer to do everything, because there is a way to do it set out for you. And that way is a graceful way, which brightens the mind considerably. I still had run-ins with the abbot. Over the years, it turns out that wherever he went, people couldn't get along with him. I just figured we had been husband and wife in a past existence. But it was the second monk who was really the teacher, and he was more understanding. I was encouraged to do the duties of a disciple, such as folding the abbot's robe, wash his feet, etc. At times, when I wished to be several thousand miles away from his abrasive presence, I would humble myself to kneel down and wash his feet. The value of this kind of practice was something I heard Ajahn Sumedho speak about many times over the years. First of all, he pointed out that we paid respects to the ideals represented by the yellow robes, not merely to the individual who happened to be wearing them. By performing the simple actions that the Vinaya required of us, we could lay down the discriminating mind with its habitual fault-finding and judging as to who was or wasn't worthy of respect, and cut through the grudges, pride, etc. Whereas by just trying to be mindful and detached from such mental states, one often goes round and round, unable to let go or cut through. And the funny thing was, I usually felt a lot better through performing these tasks, healthy mental states, such as friendliness and respect, would very naturally appear. When Vasa ended, I had intestinal worms and went right back to Wat Pah Pong. Ajahn Chah received me nicely and arranged rice gruel and a visit to a real doctor. Once I got settled in, I saw that I had grown up some during the past months. Ajahn Chah asked me one day, "You're a little happier now than you were before, aren't you?" He asked what the Vasa had been like. I told him that it wasn't easy, but that Ajahn Ñāṇiko was an excellent disciplinarian. He said that the small wats are good practice situations. You're around the same small group of people all the time, eating, working, meditating. And when you get angry or hot under the collar, there's nowhere to go. You can't get away from the people you think are causing you to suffer, so you have to look at your mind. I generally found that, in those living situations, I would tend to fixate on the smallest things, some of them probably non-existent, until it got to the point where the guy sitting next to me was responsible for 70 to 80% of the suffering in the world. It was Katina season and the beginning of winter again, once more a relaxed time in the monastery. I had more opportunity to be around Ajahn Chah. I think he was pleased that I survived my first vasa as a bhikkhu and was pretty sure I would be around for a while. One afternoon I went to his kuti to help clean up, and when I sat down he asked me if I knew about pangsakula cloth. Traditionally, it refers to pieces of cloth that people have discarded, especially cloth used to wrap a corpse. Though bhikkhus may not take things which are not offered to them, there are certain exceptions, such as visasa, i.e., using something which belongs to a fellow bhikkhu if one is certain that he wouldn't mind, or pangsakula cloth, which one has carefully considered and found to be discarded. In the present, lay people sometimes bring pieces of cloth from a corpse and hang them on the branch of a tree in the monastery to be taken by some monk. Lungpo explained all this to me, then added that I wouldn't bother doing this with someone who was going to disrobe, but for someone like Warapanyo who doesn't think about disrobing, I'm glad to, and told me that someone had brought such a cloth. Would I like to go and take it? He said I should go and look at the cloth and think, this is a piece of cloth that has been discarded, that nobody wants, and therefore it is suitable for a homeless renunciate like myself. Then I should touch the cloth and consider that formerly it was used to wrap a corpse. Now I will take it to make a robe to wrap my own body, which will likewise be a corpse someday. After all this instruction, I walked out to where the cloth was, feeling like the event was somewhat contrived, and the cloth was clean and new. Yet when I actually started doing as Lungpo had said, the concepts became very much alive and penetrated my heart. It's another example of the incredible skillfulness of the monastic conventions, which are often hard to appreciate until you actually put them into practice. Sumedho had gone to central Thailand, en route to India. There was only one other farang at Wat Papong. A few visitors came. One was Samita, a 35-year-old novice, New Yorker. He had been kicking around Thailand and Sri Lanka in robes for a few years and couldn't find a place to settle. I had met him in Bangkok the year before. In Henry Miller's phrase, it was like seeing myself in a cracked mirror. The morning he came, I took him to see Ajahn Chah before Pindabat. It took Ajahn Chah about 3 seconds to size him up. He sent his attendant novices away, everything is usually completely public there, and had a nice little chat with us, asking Samita a few questions, through me, about his past and his practice. As we were leaving, he asked me what Samita means. The peaceful one, I told him. He said, not the disturbed one. He assigned Samita to me as my, quote, disciple, unquote. It was very trying, because his mind couldn't stay on the track for very long, and he would play all kinds of games to get attention, be annoying, test my patience, etc. He was basically sincere and wanted to do good, but he really couldn't control himself. After a week or so, I was ready to put an axe in the bald spot on his head. He did come to Ajahn Chah for instruction, though, and he did seem to respect him. One morning, as we returned from the village, walking behind Ajahn Chah, who had a very leisurely pace, Samita asked me to request his permission to go on ahead of him. Ordinarily, it was sufficient just to make a gesture of respect and go on, but I asked. Lungpo just gave a half nod and made one of his belly sounds, Samita asked me what he had said, and I explained that we had permission to go ahead. Samita said reverently, I've heard that is how the great masters answer. They just make us sound like that. One afternoon at his kuti, Samita was asking him about the way he taught meditation, Did he use the method of daily interviewing? Ajahn Chah said, "Here I teach disciples to examine their own mind states, to interview themselves. Maybe Warapanyo is angry today, or maybe he has some desire in his mind. I don't know, but he should know. He doesn't have to come and ask me about it." Of course, Ajahn Chah was readily available if you needed to see him, but he definitely urged us to have this kind of self-reliance. Concerning unusual states that might occur in meditation, I think his approach is best summed up by his account of some of his meditative experiences, as described in the brief biography of him printed in Thai several years ago. Once when he was living alone, he had some experiences unlike anything that had ever happened to him, and he started wondering, what was that? But then the answer came to him. It was what it was. And his doubt settled. He was able to go deeper into the meditation. Though I should also point out that he did say that it's possible to go astray with such things if one's mindfulness isn't strong, and that a relative beginner needs to rely on a teacher's guidance in such instances. In his own case, he said that when he was just starting out, he couldn't trust his mind, but after a few years he could, and thus he was able to deal with such states by himself. The end of the year was coming, and both Samhita and I had to go to Bangkok to renew our visas, see a dentist, and do other things. Ajahn Chah had been invited to a ceremony at a temple in Ayutthaya, about 100 kilometers from Bangkok, so it was decided that we would go with him, stay there a few days, and go on to Bangkok from there. He suggested that Samhita and I might even like to take a few days and walk the last stretch together. At first it sounded good, but I soon had my fill of Samhita. So the day before we left, when Ajahn Chah was bathing, I put my palms together in the customary manner of showing respect and said, "Longpor, once we've gotten to Ayutthaya, I don't want to be responsible for looking after Samhita anymore." He turned his gaze on me and gave me one of those penetrating, world-stopping looks. "Warapanyo." Uh-oh, I thought. I shouldn't have said that. Now he's going to tell me off. I put up with you, so you can certainly put up with him. But he actually said, "Warapanyo, when we get to Ayutthaya, I want you to tell Samhita that he can't come back here. There are enough for Rung already." I had never heard of him turning anyone away before, because he felt them unfit, and I can only think of one other time he did so in later years, but Samhita was certainly a special case. Once we were in Ayutthaya, I told him. He was unhappy about it and argued with me endlessly, even though I told him it wasn't my decision. We discussed it with Ajahn Chah, who said that Samhita should go to a temple with a routine that he could fit into and submit himself to the abbot there, and then if the abbot were willing to give him a letter of sponsorship after a year of training, he could come back to Wat Pah Pong. But after Ajahn Chah got back to Wat Pah Pong, I got more and more exasperated. Finally, we took the train to Bangkok. I mentioned to him that I might call my parents in New York, and he asked if I could have them call his parents to let them know he was well. "Of course," I said. "Just give me the name and phone number." He started writing it down with a little message, but he kept on writing and writing until he had filled up a whole page and ended with, "Love, Stuart." I was supposed to dictate this to my parents, who would be paying $10 per minute for the call. I asked him to streamline it, and then he decided that maybe he would call himself, so I needn't bother. I always remembered that one episode so well, because it was a perfect example of how his mind would run away with him. From Ayutthaya, we took the train to Nonthaburi on the outskirts of Bangkok, and we went to stay with Ajahn Sumedho at Wat Pa Sri Mahatatu. The first thing I said upon arriving was, "This is my disciple, Samhita. I'm giving him to you." Sumedho, too, was very kind, but there was nothing he could do. Samhita went into Bangkok to the Wat where he had previously been staying. He came to visit a couple of times. Eventually he drifted away, went to other temples, then disrobed and went home. A few years later, we heard that he had gone back to Sri Lanka and ordained again, had another falling out with his preceptor, and went to live alone in the jungle. He was trampled by elephants and his bones were found. When Ajahn Chah was told, he said, now he can be at peace. Those who had known Samhita agreed with that appraisal. After the new year, I returned to Wat Pah Pong. It was January 1973. I was in high spirits from having spent a few weeks with Sumedho before he left for India, and from the rich Bangkok food. The first day I was back, when I went to pay my respects to Ajahn Chah, I told him that I was really going to do it this year. I would master my defilements. This too was well meant, but in poor taste by Thai standards. There were several monks present then, and those words were shoved in my face a few times over the next year when I slacked off, though never by Ajahn Chah. His methods were subtler and deadlier. Several Westerners started showing up. I was the only resident Farang, and I had become fluent in Thai and the local Lao dialect by then. So Ajahn Chah assigned them to be my, quote, disciples, unquote. He would tell them, "This is Ajahn Warapanyo." I think he's 3 vasas at that time. "This is Ajahn Warapanyo. He is your Ajahn, not because he has any wisdom, but because he's the only one who can translate for me and tell you what to do here." I recognized after a while that being given some responsibility like this was a step forward in my maturation. I also began to feel extremely privileged to be the bearer of his teachings in that way. I could comprehend the language much better than the previous year. I felt closer to the teachings because of my experience there, and I had to pay attention to everything he said and retain it, because the others were depending on me to pass it along to them. Sometimes our small contingent would get a special talk from him, and I would translate bit by bit, though when he really warmed to the subject, he would half close his eyes and go on for 5 or 10 minutes before he would stop to let me translate. When he gave a talk to the whole Sangha, I would translate it later that night or the following day. Since his talks could sometimes go on for 2 or more hours, I started making some notes. I never used a tape recorder, but some of his talks were of such power and beauty that I could practically repeat them verbatim afterwards. Such a strong impression did they make on me. One of the new people had brought Dogen's Primer of Soto Zen, containing excerpts from Dogen's talks, always prefaced by "One evening Dogen said." Dogen addressed the monks one evening saying, etc. I began to think, "One evening Cha said," and soon I was copying down summaries of talks and conversations under the title Cha Speaks. It is still in circulation over there and forms a substantial part of the material in Still Forest Pool. When I first returned as a layman in 1981 to visit the International Forest Monastery, branch number 19 of Wat Pah Pong, established in 1975 for training Western monks, it was quite a feeling when one evening a young bhikkhu ascended the Dhamma seat and read the teachings from Cha Speaks, which had been given so many years before. No matter how many times I read or hear his teachings, I am always astounded by their simple clarity. I recalled very vividly the situations in which the teachings were given and the young monks who have grown so much since then. And I realized that those days really belonged to the past, because by then Ajahn Chah was retired from teaching and was soon to stop speaking altogether due to his illness. After the fortnightly recitation of the rules, Ajahn Chah would give a talk on the monk's life and the purpose and proper use of the discipline. The themes were familiar, but his treatment of them was usually fresh and lively. This was also when he would give his longest talks, sometimes going on to 3 or even 5 a.m. That was mostly just to push the monks a bit, test their endurance, give them a chance to watch their minds. The bell might have been rung at 6 or 7, but by the time the Uposatha ceremony got started, it might be 8 or 9 p.m. He often kept us sitting there waiting for him as he talked to people at his kuti, took a bath, and strolled leisurely up to the hall. It was over in an hour, unless the monk doing the recitation fell apart. At the first sign of faltering, Ajahn Chah might start pulling the poor guy's robe, crack jokes, or start chanting himself. Then, for an hour or more, he might chat with some of the senior monks, discuss some piece of business. It could take almost an hour to count 9 monks to go to a meal at a layman's house. Then he would begin the talk. He could talk without breaking stride for about 2 hours, but if he kept on after that, we knew he was up to something. And he was aware that we knew it, and we knew that he knew that we knew, but we just had to sit there. He would go off on tangents, fish around for things to talk about, ask one of the monks a question and start answering it himself, etc. As far as I know, Ajahn Chah's approach to Vinaya is quite rare in Thailand. Monasteries which do maintain the rules are in themselves rare, but for the most part the attitude in these places is quite rigid. Ajahn Chah taught both the Dhamma and the Vinaya are conventions, tools for accomplishing a task, and he was flexible and creative in using these tools. So it was easy to find seeming contradictions if you just listened to the words he spoke. Once I asked, "You've said that as soon as we've become aware of committing an offense, we should confess it." "That's right," he answered. "But you've also said," I continued, "that just knowing that we've committed an offense is enough. We don't have to immediately run to confess it to someone." "That's right," he said. The hot season was quite miserable again that year. I had resigned myself to plodding through when all of a sudden he changed the schedule. We were to begin at 5 p.m. with 3 hours of walking meditation, then chanting, then sitting to 11. Morning practice was 3:30 until dawn, then more sitting after the meal. I could hardly believe it. Well, the senior monks always liked to talk about how tough the practice was in the old days at Wat Pah Pong, when Ajahn Chah was younger and had a small group of monks living under the most austere circumstances. This would be a little taste of it, one said. Of course, I felt very sorry for myself during the month or so that followed. But from the Thai monks, with their ox-like obedience and endurance, not the slightest sign of discomfort or displeasure could be seen. But I began to notice that most of them were falling asleep during the long hours of meditation. Indeed, their bodies being so flexible, they could often sleep in the sitting posture through most of the weekly all-night sittings. Several younger monks disrobed at this time as well, and I started to get a much more realistic picture of the Sangha. Even though Wat Pah Pong is an exceptional monastery, many of the monks are there because they are fulfilling their social obligation to spend time in a monastery, because their parents sent them, because they don't want to plow the rice fields all their lives. So I began to wonder, who was Ajahn Chah teaching? Who was it that his precious instructions were directed at? When I had first come to Wat Pah Pong, it was very inspiring to see the monks sitting there so silently as they listened to his talks. After a couple of years, it became clear that they were mostly a bunch of ordinary Joes whose hearts weren't completely in it. As Ajahn Chah once asked, "Do you really hear the lectures? Or while the teacher is talking, is your mind off somewhere thinking, 'Man, I really like sweet potatoes'?" Perhaps not all of Ajahn Chah's monasteries have carried on his living transmission, but the teachings were given freely for anyone with ears to hear. The new abbot of Bung Wai International Monastery said, after Ajahn Chah's birthday celebration in 1982, that he always felt that one of the noblest things about Ajahn Chah was that over the years he gave his teachings freely, never finding fault or criticizing those who couldn't practice properly. Ajahn Chah seemed to be especially fond of those who suffered most. In addition to his great compassion, I suspect it was because he could see the tremendous humor in people and their predicaments, not a callous humor, but a real appreciation of human striving. One such long-suffering Farang was Aranyabo, a young English novice who arrived in early 1973. He had some good meditation experience as a layman, and he was often positively brilliant in his understanding of Dhamma, but he could get kicked around by extremes of emotion. We had many an inspired conversation as we bathed at the well or drank tea at my kuti. One of his most memorable statements was, "You know, Warapanyo, what we're trying to do is impossible, but we've got to do it." So I'll leave it there for the reading this evening. Again, I just love this book because it just paints such a realistic picture of how monastic life really plays out, and the kind of trials and tribulations people were having to go through at that time. Aranyabo is the one, I think, in the Mindful Way. They interview him.
Yeah.
Any questions?
I heard Lumpur Chas and Ajahn Ñāṇiko off to start that monastery that he's at currently when he was 5 also.
Something like that, yeah. Ajahn Ñāṇiko was impressive since the very beginning. He was very, very ardent, very sincere.
I met Tina's uncle who ordained there, and he was talking about their standards really high, really good training.
Yeah. Long Da Tui,
Yeah.
Tina's uncle. People here may have met Tina. She's been coming here for years and years, decades. She was here today. Oh, really? I missed her. Okay. So yeah, Tina's uncle is, they couldn't believe he ordained. It's her sister's dad. And he's in his mid-70s and a very hard upbringing. And none of the family members could believe he ordained. Now he's like 5 vasas probably now, 4 or 5. Yeah, 5 vasas.
He just ordained when we were there.
For the 100th. Yeah, and then I met up with him. He was 3 vasas, I think, in 2019. So, but I really connected with him, and he was he was really proud that he had finished the first level of Naktam, the Dhamma studies, and that he had done this, and then, but then his granddaughter had surpassed him by finishing both the first and second level of Dhamma studies as in primary school. So he was really upset, and then he said, "That's it, I'm learning the Patimokkha." So then he said, he made this determination to learn the Patimokkha, and he said, "I want to chant my first Patimokkha at Abhayagiri." So we'll see if he, but he said, "There's just one problem. My brain is very old." So like an old brain has a hard time memorizing things. Once you memorize one thing, the previous thing's fallen away already. But he's very, very sincere. Here.